You're watching Truth Talk News. The warnings were all there. The United Nations was set up to stop war and keep peace and give freedom and liberty to the whole world. And it's done exactly the opposite. We also have the situation with our economy, the warnings.
Basis or system of prosperity, which came to be known as a free enterprise system. I think it gains its strength not because it is a system, but because of the lack of a system. In short, the government was to stay off your back and out of your pockets, or to stay away from the farms, away from the businesses, away from the professions. The government was not to be involved. We've seen a great change in my lifetime, certainly in the 20th century, away from the limitations placed upon our society by a Constitution, and most particularly a Bill of Rights, which were essentially negative documents restricting the growth and activities of government. Today we find the federal government involved in the professions, telling doctors how to doctor and telling teachers how to teach, and as one wag said, telling carpenters how to carp. But we have seen the tremendous growth in government in the 20th century, an explosive growth far beyond the boundaries imposed by our Constitution. Today, there's hardly a single area of activity in this country, or indeed around the world, where the United States federal government is not involved. This has produced, of course, an explosive growth in the cost of government. Politicians are reluctant to raise the taxes directly to pay for that explosive growth. This means deficits, and out of the deficits we have a growing national debt, where today just servicing that debt has become the third largest item in the federal budget. And to further service the debt and the creation of new money, we have had the development of a central banking apparatus, in this case the Federal Reserve System. Now, our founding fathers had a great argument over this point of the question of a central bank, and there's been argument down through the decades on this point. But one thing that is very clear with the development of this, it has become the engine of inflation. Thomas Jefferson, in warning about the question of a federal debt, had this to say: "I place economy among the first and most important virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared. To preserve our independence, we must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. If we run into such debts, we must be taxed in our meat and drinks, in our necessities and comforts, in our labors and our amusements. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they must become happy." I think the emphasis on that has to be that last sentence, that if we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they must become happy. Now, with this explosive growth of new money, that means, of course, inflation. Now, I know that many people are being led to believe that politicians in Washington during the political season are going to save us from the ravages of inflation. Perhaps if you only remember one thing tonight, I hope you will remember at least this: that politicians do not fear inflation. They love it, because inflation is the mechanism that allows them to expand the currency, to satisfy, to make up the deficits that allow them to pay for the expanding federal program, to satisfy the special interest groups, to guarantee their elections. Politicians do not fear inflation. They love it. It is the mechanism for buying votes, in so many cases, to ensure their re-elections. So many people today have the attitude that inflation is a problem of rising prices. Indeed, we are led to believe that this is the case. And as long as we lack an understanding of basic issues, we will continue to be plagued with problems like inflation. But saying that inflation is like rising prices, is just about as foolish as saying that wet streets cause rain. This tremendous growth in inflation, in government, has brought us the deficits and debt exactly that as feared by Thomas Jefferson and many other of our founding fathers, to where today we have the greatest debt in the history of the world, approaching officially $1 trillion. But you know, when you go to the areas of unfunded liability, you're looking at a debt approaching $8 or $9 trillion. If you handle the government accounting in the same way that you would handle in the case of a private business or profession, in the area of promises made but money not in the till, you're looking at a massive debt of 7, 8, or 9 trillions of dollars. With the growth of government, we have seen a strangulation of our productive society, with agencies such as EPA, OSHA, and many others, that vast alphabet soup in Washington. We're finding that American productivity is grounding down to the level of stagnation. Competing countries such as West Germany, Switzerland, and Japan are expanding their productive capability per person at a rate of 10, 12% steadily right along. This has meant that in the competitive world of the world markets, we find that American goods have increasing difficulties. Well, the simple answer that many people propose is the way to solve this, of course, is just simply higher tariffs. But you know, the last time we adopted that philosophy was back during the late 20s, early 30s, and with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Acts. And most economists will agree that the great worldwide depression was linked to the tariff wars of that period. There wasn't anything very good about the last great worldwide depression, and I certainly don't think that many of us would agree that we need another one today. There's been a basic shift in the philosophy of our society and philosophy of government away from the concept of the government's function to protect life and property and over to a concept of government being the agent for the redistribution of income. Today, 60% of the federal budget activity, of the federal government's activity, is that category known as transfer payments. This is where you use the power of government to take money from those who earned it and transfer it over to those who did not. This means that in the process of doing that, we're increasingly penalizing the productive sector and subsidizing the non-productive sector. So that your government's major function today is that of being the leveler of society in the redistribution of income. Now, one thing is very clear in reading the writings of our founding fathers, in writing the Constitution and in adding the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, they did everything they could to make the leveling of society as a function of government unconstitutional. Today, that's 60% of the federal activity. You know, I speak to a lot of high school and student groups. I frequently ask the students in philosophical terms, what is the proper function of the federal government? The typical answer is that government today should provide me with those things that I feel that I need that I cannot provide for myself. Unfortunately, this is not an atypical answer. This is the traditional or typical answer. This has brought about a tremendous change where more and more people are being led to believe, you know, it's a lot easier to vote yourself a living than it is to work for a living. I think the growing welfare rolls reflects the continuing attitude of government's function as a provider rather than a protector.
Yeah, I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Is that a conspiracy?
Well, you've certainly...
Let me just tell you what Newsweek says this. The John Birch Society considers communism only one arm of a master conspiracy in which socialist American insiders are plotting to establish world government. Now, it also says, and here's Director John McManus, that's your public relations director, saying that former Secretary of State Alexander Haig and CIA Director William Casey are two of these master conspirators who are plotting to establish world government. Now, what do you say? You know, that kind of silly, asinine statement is what makes people laugh at the John Birch Society.
Well, Tom, I'm sure being a long-standing member of the Rockefeller apparatus and as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations of longstanding, you're fully aware that there is an elitist core in this country that has seen value in subsidizing communism or protecting communism.
It has?
Sure.
You're accusing me of subsidizing communism?
No, I'm saying
because
that
I happen to belong to a
there is an elite core.
Study group?
No, wait a minute. There is an elite core in this country that has dominated American society.
Well, I'm not one of them.
Well,
Trilateral Commission.
The Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations.
State Department, I suppose?
Well, let's face it, they've dominated the State Department for 40 years, and pretty much openly
All right,
so.
but what are they trying to do?
Well, their objective is to try to bring about a gradual transition in our society, a dissolving of sovereignty, and a moving steadily to the left on the political spectrum.
Well, who are they?
Belief, the elitist groups that I mentioned, particularly key individuals and policymakers in the Council on
Is the
Foreign
International
Relations.
Monetary Fund part of this?
Well, I would say the International Monetary Fund has certainly been set up for the purpose of facilitating that transfer of sovereignty and transfer of wealth on the road.
All right, we
to
elected
something.
Mr. Conservative.
Let me just finish the point, because otherwise we're going to have a lot of unanswered questions. That you are looking at a group that has worked to bring about a dissolution of national sovereignties on the road to world government. And certainly you're familiar with local professor Carroll Quigley, who has been part of your club, in which he admitted all this. And he said in his book, Tragedy and Hope, the only thing I disagree is that we've worked to keep it a secret. And you see Arthur Schlesinger Jr. writing way back in 1947, says, yes, this is the hidden policy of America. But we can't tell the American public because they're too unsophisticated to see the value.
What is the instrumentality of world government? What is the
Of all the
instrumentality through
things
which...
to say about Arthur Schlesinger, that's the silliest statement I ever heard. He never made anything like that.
Well, let me suggest that you read the May-June issue of the Partisan Review of 1947, Tom, and you can read it for yourself. It's called
Arthur Schlesinger said there was a conspiracy, to promote communism.
No, he didn't use the word conspiracy.
I
He
think
said the
Tom-
objective
Oh,
was
what
to
kind of
bring about...
nonsense is
Well, let me finish. I'll tell you. He said that the objective, the secret policy, which we can't tell the American public because they're not sophisticated enough to see the value, is that through a steady result of erosion of new deals, we bring the American society steadily to the left, and through a sound concept of benign containment, we merge into the vital center of the socialist left. Those are his words, not mine.
I think John Kennedy was a member of that conspiracy?
No, let me ask you this. The World Federalist movement in the post-war era contained a lot of people who eventually broke with it, and a lot of people thought the UN in the post-war era looked toward world government. Sure. Indeed they did, up until 48, 49. But a lot of them said, look, we were utopian, that's over and done with. We can't move. And a lot of them came in Kennedy's government. Schlesinger was in there when they were fighting in Vietnam, launched the effort in Vietnam. Schlesinger was behind the Bay of Pigs. In other words, look, isn't there some move that occurred in the post-war era that now has been dissipated because nobody believes in the utopian ideal of world government anymore?
Well, I think there are those that realize that moving straight from a prototype of the United Nations into world government perhaps is tactically impossible. But phasing out increasingly national sovereignty into regional government and phasing out sovereignties into international treaties in multiple areas could be a route.
The whole movement toward, quote, interdependence.
Yeah.
NATO is part of the conspiracy?
Well, there are certainly elements in NATO. There are people in NATO who are very strongly dedicated to the defense of the West. But at the same time, you find in NATO a steady dissolution. You find a growing weakness as a NATO policy dominated by State Department policies that has not worked.
Well, it's a regional grouping, and I think, therefore, it may be suspect by the John Birch Society.
On September 1st, 1983, the plane carrying 269 passengers, including Congressman Larry P. McDonald, was shot down by the Soviets, supposedly after entering Soviet airspace. But once again, the connection between the Rockefeller family and the Soviet Union is a great connection. In fact, the Russian people embrace Rockefeller and always have. I'm Howard Nima. Thank you for watching Truth Talk News.
In short, the government is to stay off your back and out of your pockets, or to stay away from the farms, away from the businesses, away from the professions. The government was not to be involved. We've seen a great change in my lifetime, certainly in the 20th century, away from the limitations placed upon our society by a Constitution, and most particularly a Bill of Rights, which were essentially negative documents restricting the growth and activities of government. Today, we find the federal government involved in the professions, telling doctors how to doctor and telling teachers how to teach, and as one wag said, telling carpenters how to carp. But we have seen the tremendous growth in government in the 20th century, an explosive growth far beyond the boundaries imposed by our Constitution. Today, there's hardly a single area of activity in this country or indeed around the world where the United States federal government is not involved. This has produced, of course, an explosive growth in the cost of government. Politicians are reluctant to raise the taxes directly to pay for that explosive growth. This means deficits, and out of the deficits, we have a growing national debt, where today just servicing that debt has become the third largest item in the federal budget. And to further service the debt and the creation of new money, we have had...
The United Nations was set up to stop war and keep peace and give freedom and liberty to the whole world. And it's done exactly the opposite. We also have the situation with our economy, the warnings.
Basis or system of prosperity, which came to be known as a free enterprise system. I think it gains its strength not because it is a system, but because of the lack of a system.
You're watching Truth Talk News. The warnings were all there.